welcome to the Cory Morgan Show. I'm going to start and get right into it with thanking members, thanking supporters, thanking people out there for subscribing to the Western Standard. We've been doing just great, and it's fantastic having alternative media sources like this where we can speak openly on issues. Because we're going to go into one today that the mainstream isn't talking about so much during a crisis in British Columbia. We've got some terrible flooding happening out there, and we're seeing some people playing politics with it. Of course, well, that's the nature of politics, but we need to clarify those things, talk about what's really going on out there before others can take advantage of the tragedy that's happening on our West Coast and use that for policies that really might have little to no impact on the well-being of people out there. So again, I want to thank those members. If you haven't taken out a membership with the Western Standard yet, get out there, go to the westernstandardonline.com. Take out a membership, try it out. There's a free trial. You can have it for 2 weeks, get full access to all of our columns, our news stories as they break. We got a great team out there throughout Western Canada putting stuff out as it breaks. And check it out. After 2 weeks, if you don't like it, you don't think you're getting a good deal for $10 a month, you don't have to carry on. But I suspect you're going to stay on because, I mean, it's cheaper than an old newspaper subscription used to be. It's faster news than the old newspapers used to be, and it's some great content. So getting to where I was going with today's show, I'm going to be speaking with Michelle Stirling from the Friends of Science. It's an organization that's been providing counterpoints and straight science to try and at least cut through some of the climate change rhetoric and dogma that's going on out there. And climate change has been a big subject all week. I mean, we just had the COP24 conference out in Glasgow where tens of thousands of worldwide environmentalists all gathered to talk about how they were going to save us all from climate change. Emitting massive amounts of emissions on their way out there. Jody Gondek in Calgary declared a climate emergency. That was her top item as the mayor of Calgary, the first thing she had to do. And now in British Columbia, we have some terrible flooding hitting out there. Princeton's underwater, Merritt's underwater, Abbotsford's at risk. But then we got Elizabeth May out there beaking off, saying it was caused by fossil fuels. We have Catherine McKenna going on, saying that we need climate policy to stop these sorts of things. It's ridiculous. At least let the floodwaters recede before you start with your rhetoric and BS. But we know that people like Lizzie May and the Climate Barbie aren't going to hang on for realistic evaluation of what's happened. They want to score their political points right now. So I'm going to have an interesting talk, though, with like I said, Michelle Stirling from Friends of Science, and we'll cut through to some of what's really going on out there. Oh, thank you very much for joining me on the show again, Michelle. It's always great getting you on, and there's never a shortage of things to talk about. Climate change is always big in the news, and lately it's just been all over the news after the big COP26 thing in Glasgow, and now our local climate emergency, and of course that tragic situation out in BC. So thanks for coming on today to talk to me about some of these things.
My pleasure.
So I guess the top of the news right now is the terrible flooding and tragedy that's going on out in British Columbia. We've seen, as I said in my introduction, Elizabeth May and Catherine McKenna taking advantage of that situation and trying to blame it on climate change. And we need a little bit of reality added to what the causes of this circumstance are out there. You said you had some information about the lake out there?
Yes, actually. Well, especially in the Fraser Valley, the whole area there around Abbotsford is actually Sumas Lake. It's a lake that was drained about 100 years ago. And in this little clip from Vancouver Traces, it says humans have lived here for at least 10,000 years, but many are unaware as they drive between Abbotsford and Chilliwack that they're driving along the bottom of a drained lake. And the scariest part at the end, almost prescient now, says the lake has been home of the Sumas First Nation since time immemorial and would return in a few days if the Barrowtown pump station stopped running. And last night, Abbotsford had an emergency declaration evacuation because they were very concerned that it would go. And I guess there's still some concern about the Nozick River, which is in the States, as I understand, flooding back over into the Canadian side. And not to mention, there's still lots of snow melt coming down off the mountains. So it's a big catastrophe already and could get worse, sadly. But it's not a climate change event. It's a weather event. It's an atmospheric river.
Yeah, and river deltas are always, I mean, vulnerable to that sort of thing. People who have traveled, you see how flat they are. Like for people who haven't been to New Orleans, boy, what the striking thing there is how flat that city is. I mean, the highest point is the overpasses on the interstate, so you can see why it was so vulnerable to a surge of water. I mean, we've artificially built dikes and do pumping and do what we can to make things habitable there, but now and then we're just going to get overwhelmed.
That's right. And not to mention, one of our forestry people offered these insights on just the power of the water. You know, if you take a 1 square meter pan and fill it with 1 millimeter of water, that's 1 liter of water. It weighs 1 kilogram. So take the last 72 hours with 150 millimeters of water, and you get some idea not just of the depth, but the forces that are at work on these watersheds. So this burdensome weight is also flowing down these mountains, and this is why we see the Coquihalla ripped to shreds. Tremendous forces far beyond what humankind can even defend against in many cases.
Well, yeah, I mean, the force of water can strip a mountain clean in no time. I mean, hydraulic gold mining used to be quite common a long time ago, and it did terrible environmental damage to areas that took decades to recover. But we discovered that water could be very powerful in washing away hillsides. Unfortunately, it can do that beyond our control as well.
Yeah. And the problem is, of course, people generally over time have built on floodplains. Calgary is a big example of that because originally people wanted to be by the river. They used the river for transportation, they used it for water, sanitation. So you had to be near enough to walk. And that's why people built around rivers and on floodplains. And floodplains are very fertile. Um, Parker Gallant sent me something yesterday showing that in Manitoba, for instance, 70% of the population live on a floodplain at high risk. But in Manitoba, they created, I think it's called Duff's Ditch. They built a huge diversion tunnel. And that has really saved the city quite a few times. It's still always going to be subject to flooding because it's very low land. And again, it's the bottom of a glacial lake called Lake Agassiz or Agassiz, however you like to say it. So that, this is quite prevalent across Canada, that many places are built on floodplains, and they're not built for these larger floods. They're built for, sort of small 2 or 3 feet coming up from the river. They're not built for these kinds of floods.
Yeah, well, I guess all we can do for now is hope that Mother Nature relents soon and they can start rebuilding and as few people as possible are harmed in that terrible situation in BC. But we want to make sure that people come back with a rational response and look at how can we mitigate this in the future? What are we going to do with it and where do we go from there? So
Yeah,
getting
and,
onto
and
the
that's the big problem. Sorry, I interrupted you, but
no
that's the
problem.
big problem with people claiming this is climate change. You're going to have a whole faction of very influential people. I mean, remember in the Deloitte report, the various governments in Canada have funded 31 ENGOs with $2.1 billion. And these are all the climate change activists. And they're all going to be yapping about, so we have to reduce fossil fuels and build wind and solar farms, when really we have to build dikes. We have to build resilient housing, maybe even on stilts. We maybe have to rethink how some of these communities that are being wiped out are going to be rebuilt. But certainly wind farms and solar farms are not going to do anything to prevent any future catastrophes like this.
No, I mean we can't carbon tax our way out of this, and we know areas that are prone to disasters. If anybody travels the Gulf of Mexico, you do see the houses are all on stilts because they periodically get hit with hurricanes. It's been
Mhm.
hit down there for 1,000 years, and probably will be for 1,000 more.
Yeah, and that I guess also we had mentioned something about the Calgary Declaration for a Climate Emergency, and that's really sort of the insult, shall we say, of these cities declaring climate emergencies when very real, uh, destructive, tragic emergencies, real emergencies like the one going on in BC happen, and yet these people sitting in council chambers are voting for a climate emergency declaration when nothing of the sort is going on. There's no climate emergency. This whole climate emergency thinking comes from misuse of what's known as the RCP 8.5, which is a scenario that is implausible, but it's the one that's been most used in evaluating future projections of climate change and temperature. And that's why it feels like there's been a catastrophe. But the most recent IPCC report, if you actually read the full report and not the politicized summary for policymakers, if you read the full report, or if you read proper analysis of the full report, like by Roger Pielke Jr., you find that actually this RCP 8.5 is no longer being used. It's not considered to be our future. And that means the climate emergency is over, and we do have time.
Well, we spend our time nitpicking over emissions and virtue signaling with climate emergencies when we got real things we could work on, like forest fires. Proper forest management can really mitigate and reduce the risks and intensity of forest fires, but we aren't focused on that because everybody's talking about this bigger climate change picture.
That's right. I mean, if you look at Logan Lake in BC, this summer they were surrounded by fire, but they followed all the Fire Smart recommendations. And anyone who's listening, if you're in Canada, I suggest that you look up Fire Smart and see how you can protect your own home or your own community by using these recommendations. And also in the States, you can look up FireWise. So there are very practical considerations, like moving shrubbery 100 meters from your house. Just the setbacks of vegetation makes a huge difference as to whether or not your house goes up in flames or whether just your shrubs go up in flames. Having a metal roof, cleaning out your drains and gutters. A lot of them are fairly simple, but people maybe don't think about them, or they have all kinds of junk stacked on their deck. Well, if you get any kind of embers that land on that junk, it'll go up on your deck and then your house will go up. So, Fire Smart, FireWise, the Logan Lake success was never headline news across Canada. The only thing they talked about was the wildfire that burnt down Lytton. And Lytton actually has been burned down 4 times before in the past. So, people also need to take a look at history before they start putting the climate change label on top of everything, because most of these things happened before.
Yeah, I mean, we just want to mitigate. We do want to make things better. Similarly, with if you do live in an area that's prone to flooding, there's things you can do with your landscaping. You might want to have a secondary pump at your house to be able to pump your basement if the water's coming up on you. I mean, there's things you can do. And if we keep talking about this big, broad picture, you might ignore the smaller things that are actually going to have a much more direct impact on your safety and the protection of your property.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I mean, once in my parents' house, which they had parged the basement and done all kinds of things to protect it, there was flooding in the basement. And I went outside to see what was happening. And I realized that the county had never dug a ditch on one side of the road. And all the water was pouring through the ditch and straight into their backyard and into the basement. So, things like that, if you do a proper reconnaissance of your property and watch when it rains, where does it go? Where is it coming from? Where does it go? And you can get professional people in to help you redirect that water. Not to mention all the other things that there's lots of tips online. Of course, when it's catastrophic flooding, some of those things are beyond anyone. But, to label it as climate change is ridiculous.
Yeah, they're taking advantage of a tragic weather event.
Yeah.
So getting to the broader picture, I mean, the Glasgow conference came out, 40,000 of our betters gathered, mostly by air, and have determined how they're going to save the world. What was your interpretation of their conclusions this time around?
Well, it's amazing how they all got together and decided on things that probably can't be done. Like Robert Lyman wrote a report or a short commentary for us called Theater of the Absurd. That's how he sees these conferences. And he's saying, that all of these conferences, they don't have any legal effect, which is pretty good, other than Kyoto. But then we backed out of it, which is smart of us. They're mostly based on bribes, like the Paris Agreement was based on the bribe of providing $100 billion a year to developing nations for them to get on board. And this Green Climate Fund would be handed out to them with no accountability. And just so you know, the people who could apply for the Green Climate Fund would include wealthy countries like Saudi Arabia, China, and some of the other very wealthy oil producing nations. And countries that would have to be paying in would be countries like us, and bankrupt Greece would even have to pay into this fund. So this time, they never did get that money together. And actually in the September of 2019, China and India went to the New York Climate Conference and said, hey, pay up. You know, you wanted us to be on board. We played along. Show us the money. So this time at COP, they decided these countries are coming back and saying, well, we want $1 trillion, or I think Africa wants $3 trillion. So some of the points that Robert makes here, that they've agreed to phase down, excuse me, unabated coal power. Well, of course, most of the developing world runs on coal. And why not? You know, it's really abundant. It has been cheap until now. Its price is going up with the energy crisis. But, you know, you can store at one power plant enough coal for a whole year, which you can't do with anything else. I mean, this is why the UK is having energy problems, because they've run out of reserve natural gas. And of course, natural gas can't just be dumped on the ground. It has to be in highly pressurized containers. So you have to have a constant supply, and you have to have experts running it. Whereas with coal, I mean, even if you're an ordinary citizen, if you have a lump of coal, you can put it on the grill, and you know, you can generate heat or cooking. And COP decided to move toward ending inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But unsurprisingly, there is no reference to eliminating hopelessly inefficient subsidies to wind and solar, right? And COP26 agreed to recognize a need for a just transition. Well, who would argue for an unjust transition? This is what Robert writes. A just transition is code for endorsing the need for governments having subsidized non-fossil fuel alternatives and driven energy miners out of business, then to subsidize the unemployed workers so they can move to lower paying jobs. Doesn't sound that just to me. So this is on our blog. It's called The Theater of the Absurd. And so if you want to read all the details that Robert writes up here about what they quote unquote accomplished, please feel free. It's they really didn't accomplish much. And they did launch this group called the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. Well, this includes Quebec and California, which is ironic since Quebec has a huge oil and gas industry and in refining, and California is also competing all the time with Texas. But it's no doubt that this alliance makes it more palatable to their citizens because they're both so green in Quebec and California. And, you know, so, I mean, Alok Sharma at the end of the COP conference was almost crying. This is a grown man crying about a conference that didn't come together the way they assumed it would, you know, which really is theater of the absurd.
It really is crazy. I do appreciate the work that you and the Friends of Science do in cutting through this. So where can people go to, because you're always putting out new articles and updates and things such as that. Where can they keep up to date with what you guys are up to?
Well, you can go to our main website, www.friendsofscience.org. There's a link there for our blog. You can go to our YouTube page. We do all kinds of little commentaries. I did one about the dinosaur that they used as a prop for COP26. Really sciencey, guys. And we have a Facebook page. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Actually, LinkedIn had taken us down a couple of weeks ago, but they finally put us back up. So we'd love to have people engage in the conversation and help us keep censorship away.
Great. Well, please keep fighting the good fight. And thank you again for coming on. I'm certain we'll be talking again soon.
Okay, my pleasure. Thanks, Corey.